Welcome, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to Humanities Decanted, which is the IHC's informal showcase in which faculty members present and discuss their newest research and creative work. My name is Susan Derwin, and I'm the director of the IHC, and I'm really happy to see so many of you here today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located, and I would like to pay respect to elders, both past and present. And I am delighted today to welcome our featured faculty member, Professor Lisa Jacobson of the History Department. Professor Jacobson is a cultural historian of the late 19th and 20th century United States who studies the histories of consumer culture, food and alcoholic beverages, capitalism and the senses, and childhood, gender, and the family. She is the author of Raising Consumers, Children in the American Mass Market in the Earliest 20th Century, and today she will be discussing her new book, Intoxicating Pleasures, The Reinvention of Wine, Beer, and Whiskey After Prohibition. And she will be in dialogue with Professor Erika Rappaport, a European cultural historian who researches and teaches the history of gender and consumer cultures in modern Britain and its empire. Professor Rappaport's writings include the monographs A Thirst for Empire, How Tea Shaped the Modern World, and Shopping for Pleasure, Women in the Making of London's West End. So Professor Jacobson is going to begin with a short presentation, and then she and Professor Rappaport will speak with each other for about 30 minutes. Following their conversation, we'll open up the discussion to you, our audience members, so that you can ask questions and share your thoughts. So feel free to continue drinking and snacking during the event, and help me welcome now Professor Jacobson.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you all, and thank you, Susan, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Chris, for organizing the event, and of course, many thanks to Erika, my dear friend and colleague and collaborator in all things food history and consumer culture, for agreeing to be my interlocutor today. So, just a few words about how did I come to this topic. When I started researching the book, I set out to answer a deceptively simple question. How did alcoholic beverages, substances once banned during Prohibition, shed their stigmatized pasts and become widely accepted as ordinary, respectable pleasures? Now, in the conventional telling, it's usually assumed that because Prohibition was so widely ignored, because Prohibition, there was so much frustration with Prohibition, that the repeal of Prohibition was itself confirmation of alcohol's mainstream acceptance. But that was not the case. When the 21st Amendment repealing Prohibition returned alcohol regulation to the states in 1933, vast swaths of the country, something on the order of 1 in 6 Americans, still lived under some alcohol ban. And many of the new alcohol controls continued to treat alcohol and drinkers as morally suspect. So repeal didn't suddenly wash away all of the stigmas that had justified Prohibition. In fact, the industry is still regarded as unsavory. They're thought of as merchants of booze, alcohol traffickers. And this reputation, of course, is enhanced by the fact that many of the major players in the whiskey industry made small fortunes running bootleg operations during Prohibition. So wine, beer, and whiskey, there's a reason why I look at all three. They each face distinct marketing and regulatory challenges. Beer and whiskey had to be redeemed from the disrepute of the saloon. Wine had to be rescued from its foreign associations with immigrant drinking traditions and elite connoisseurship, winemakers also had to figure out how to adapt to the fact that many Americans had developed a taste for really potent beverages and really sweet ones during Prohibition. Trade barriers that kept liquor out of restaurants and wine and beer off grocery store shelves had to be lifted. And none of this could be accomplished without winning women who had previously ranked among Prohibition's biggest supporters to the industry's side. So in the end, as my book shows, it took a world war and a battalion of advertisers, public relations experts, industry trade associations, home economists, and other tastemakers to transform alcohol from a transgressive vice into an ordinary, respectable pleasure. And in the process of doing so, many Americans came to see alcohol as an entitlement of citizenship and of military service. So, since this is a Humanities decanted event, I could not resist sharing a story with you about decanters. There aren't many researchers who can actually do that. Now, this particular story will appear in a different publication, but it illustrates a central theme in my book, which is that redeeming and reinventing alcohol was a messy and complicated process. So one thing to understand after repeal is that the distilled spirits industry is really worried about antagonizing women. They're really worried about reigniting the ire of prohibitionists. So they decide fairly early on to collectively and voluntarily ban representations of women in liquor ads. This is a ban that holds until 1958. Now, the ban is intended to be a goodwill gesture, but it's ultimately not too big a sacrifice because whiskey's cachet derives in part from its reputation as a masculine beverage. But distillers don't want to abandon women as a market. They just look for more discreet ways of reaching them. And here is where the decanter comes in. In the 1950s and 1960s, selling whiskey packaged in beautiful decanters, as you see in this advertisement, became one of the industry's most successful under-the-radar merchandising schemes. During the holiday season in November and December, retailers and magazine ads like this one hyped elegantly packaged whiskey as the perfect gift. And you can see no women in that ad, but what the ads didn't say directly was that this gift was also sure to please the recipient's wife. And in fact, market research studies found that women liked to buy or receive whiskey sold in beautiful decanters because they could use the empty bottle to store oil and vinegar, dispense iced tea, hold candles. The ambitious do-it-yourselfer might transform a decanter into a lamp base or an elaborate chandelier, and these pictures were all gathered from Pinterest, so you can see that this idea of upcycling whiskey decanters still holds appeal. Now, the trouble with decanters, one man told a market researcher, was that women like to keep them, and then one day they suddenly discover that their husband has been spending too much money on whiskey. Or, if the women drink themselves, the decanter reminds them of their own overindulgence. Other women, when confronted with a dusty assortment of empty decanters, felt guilty for not following through with their plan to repurpose the decanter. So here you have a decanter that's supposed to be a symbol of respectability, a symbol of rational consumption. You're upcycling, recycling, but it had this eerie ability to elicit consumer guilt about excessive drinking, wasteful spending, and uncompleted home improvement projects. So this story highlights a recurring theme in my book, which is that the pleasures and perils of alcoholic beverages were sometimes hard to disentangle. And that presented a challenge for alcohol marketers. The industry recognized that women were key to alcohol's redemption, but they were uncertain about the best way to win them over. Hyping alcohol's respectability seemed like the easy solution, but that tactic also had unanticipated liabilities. And before Erika and I start our conversation, I want to point you to a flyer if you're interested in purchasing the book. There's a 30% off, University of California Press. If you have not yet sampled just what the contents of a decanter can deliver, there are delicious chocolate bourbon pecan bars, and there may be 7 left. So, all right.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, it's such a pleasure, and thank you all for coming. And I do recommend the bars, which I knew were going to go fast, so I ate one immediately. You can really savor the chocolate and bourbon together. So this is really a pleasure for me because, as you might have implied, Lisa and I have taught together. We got to write together at one point, and I will embarrass her at first with a story. We were so engrossed in talking about the history of alcohol we used to be part of a multi-campus research group, and we were driving up to UC Santa Cruz, and we were so excited about this book. I remember that we got terribly lost in Salinas. Absolutely. And although you are an excellent writer, she is not a good navigator. No. This was before we had iPhones. So it's been a while, but it was, and that was a great project. We had a wonderful group of scholars that also really were part of the book, and I think grad students and faculty. So it was really wonderful. And I want to say first, this book, it's truly intoxicating. The title is excellent. And I have been using it. I've read parts of it in draft and parts of the articles, but reading it just, recently has been my escape from the present situation we're living in. And I found myself, my husband was like, I kept finding myself laughing out loud reading this book. As you could see with the story about decanters, Lisa has an amazing satirical eye, and there's a lot of really humorous things in the book besides very, very important things about the history of American ideas about pleasure, citizenship, government, etc. But the thing that made me laugh the most in the book was a recipe that the beer industry tried to encourage housewives to use more beer in their cooking, and they had a recipe for melon balls in beer dressing. I just lost it when I read that. And the dressing was literally just putting melon balls in beer. Very easy. So I asked Lisa if she tried it, but I hope not. But anyhow, the book is filled with these kind of missteps and also the successes of advertisers, but missteps that tell us a lot. And I think one thing that we take away is that your book tells us not only how alcohol was reinvented and became part of the American way of life, but literally, how we drink, when we drink, why we drink particular beverages at what time in certain glasses, and then how it shapes and is shaped by religion, class, gender, regional identities, race is really significant in the book. So I came away again and again with these sort of aha moments of like all these things that you think are just part of your local community is really very much, as you put it, a battalion of people have created that. So it's really fabulous. And so I would urge you to, I'll buy the book, and then you will feel like drinking, though, when you do it. So I have some questions, and then I think we're going to be opening it up to the audience. But the first thing I thought that's so interesting about this book is, and I thought about it, it was sort of like the whiskeys in her book, it's very much a blend of methodologies. So it has, she's just a master of political economy, policy history, business history, cultural history, and all of these things come together to really think about how notions of pleasure become commodified and acceptable in American life, but always, as you say, with this tinge of guilt and anxiety. It's sort of, pleasure is part of the history, but then it's never, there's like always tension and remaking. So it's very interesting. And the book is structured around really two key moments. One is the Great Depression, and the other is World War II. So I was really struck, and I should have known this through all my conversations with Lisa, but it never really sunk in until I read the book, that the repeal of Prohibition was so tied to New Deal politics. And I thought that would be a really interesting way. I was fascinated why you have, the chapter's title is A New Deal for Alcohol. And I wondered whether the Democratic Party could use something similar in order to regain our popularity. But I was really surprised about how the end of Prohibition and the fact of also dries, prohibitionists, were still a major force in American politics, and that many localities and states maintained some degree of prohibition long after repeal until the late 1960s. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit more about the kind of role of the New Deal, and maybe actually your thoughts about whether the Democratic Party should do something similar, get us out of our present situation, but also, that persistence, as you mentioned when you opened, that some states still had prohibition. So it was like till 1966, I think. Yeah, very late. Yeah.
Yes. Well, and some counties still do.
Yep. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that great question. So I think repeal really is one of the first significant achievements of the New Deal. And the modern Democratic Party becomes this multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition that rallies around a campaign to repeal prohibition, and if that's not possible, they'll settle for second best, which is to re-legalize beer. And so I'm going to show you a little picture of an early campaign to do that, just that. Now, we want beer. This is the chant of the parade. This is the biggest in New York City, the biggest beer parade that was staged in May 1932. It draws, this widest array of possible people marching to demand a return of beer. You've got the working class, African Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, the groups who really bore the brunt of selective prohibition enforcement are out there. And then you also have industrial magnates, the DuPonts, the Chrysler and E.F. Hutton out there marching. What is their investment in repeal? They don't want to pay high income taxes. They hope that the return of excise taxes on alcohol will relieve them of that burden. But the others want beer. Now, what's fascinating about this is in New York City. This is 150,000 people. This lasts 11 hours. They're walking around, and the crowd is just huge. This is my favorite part. What are they marching for? Beer for taxation. This, I probably suspect, is one of the only times that Americans have marched to tax themselves. And you have, beer, balance the budget. So there's this kind of conservative message here that's framing this consumer demand. We want beer back as a kind of patriotic sacrifice. We'll pay the taxes, we'll balance the budget, we'll solve the unemployment crisis, and justice will be restored. And I think, if you think about, FDR was bound to win, but I think, does he get the landslide? Does he get the commanding majorities in the Senate and the House without repeal fueling it? And I'll just give you one example that really stood out to me, which was, the Democratic National Convention is a couple months later, and it's a rowdy group, but a 25-minute demonstration on the floor when the platform for repeal and relegalizing beer comes out, that's real commitment. And one of the first accomplishments of the New Deal is to legalize 3.2% beer, a very weak, low-alcohol beer. There are extended congressional debates that go on for weeks in which you hear friendly testimony from physicians and industrial toxicologists attesting to the fact that 3.2% beer is indeed non-intoxicating. It has to be non-intoxicating or it can't sneak in while the 18th Amendment is still in effect. So that's one of the first accomplishments of the New Deal, and I think it's not remembered by historians as such, but I think it was really important at the time. The other connection to the New Deal that I'd like to emphasize just comes from some of the key players in the administration. So, and adjacent to the administration, one is Rexford Tugwell, Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, and he, delivers this speech that he titles Women, Wine, and the New Deal. And he basically says, and he's speaking to Women National Democratic Club and says, if you want to make repeal work, women, you're going to have to accompany your husbands to beer gardens. You're going to have to serve wine with meals, and you're going to have to work to abandon these Prohibition-era excesses. So there's this fantasy of transforming the United States from a liquor-loving nation into a temperate republic of wine and beer drinkers. And that fantasy also gets picked up by Joseph Coate, who's the head of the Federal Alcohol Control Administration. And he says, he has this idea, if everybody stopped drinking liquor and instead drank 4 glasses of wine a week, we could put farmers back to, who are, suffering from overproduction of other stuff. We can get them growing grapes, and we will have a temperate country, and we'll solve unemployment. So this is a fantasy that's embedded in the New Deal. Now, the second part of your question was about alcohol control regulations, and I think what I see is that repeal isn't a victory for permissive norms. It's actually quite conservative in many ways. And let me just show you a map that shows you the alcohol control system. This is actually from 2022, but large chunks of it are the same. You get a crazy patchwork quilt of regulations differing, in every county, every state. Some states, the ones in gray, are open states. These, have licensed retailers. The others in color are monopoly states in which the state does both the wholesale and retail role and sells alcohol from a highly controlled store. They are deliberately hard to find. There's no advertising outside. There's no advertising inside. So, and you can see what they're regulating, that some alcoholic beverages are regulated more intensely than others. So wine and beer tend to be regulated more lightly in terms of excise taxes, in terms of where they can be sold, but spirits are going to get regulated more stringently. Some states, sell only just spirits, but you can buy wine and beer elsewhere. Others, it's spirits and wine that can only be purchased from a store. Utah's an interesting case here. Everything sold from the state-run store, including heavy beer. Note the asterisks, which they say anything with greater than 5%. This is the legacy of 3.2 beer. So in places where everything else is really stringently regulated, you still have 3.2 beer because, of course, it's non-intoxicating. Now, if this map were from, the 30s and 40s, you would see 3 states that are completely dry: Oklahoma and Kansas and Mississippi. And Mississippi doesn't abandon its dry statutes until 1966. The other thing about the map that's really misleading, and this reminds me of how our electoral maps are really misleading, because it looks like, okay, well, most of the state has free selling. It's not documenting the counties. And in each of these states has a lot of counties that can opt out and remain completely dry. If they want to, local option elections are held either annually or every other year. My favorite example is the state of Kentucky. Now, you would think Kentucky would be pretty open. It is the home of the bourbon industry, right? But no, there are more dry counties than wet in Kentucky, owing in part to the presence of evangelical Protestants. And just to show you one more picture, here is the interior of a state-run liquor store. Now, the idea of the state-run liquor store is that you're trying to take the profit motive out of selling liquor, and so you're deliberately trying to make it as uninviting as possible. You're going to encounter a probably unfriendly and definitely unhelpful clerk. This one's behind a chain link, fence or barrier. You notice there's nothing on the walls. I mean, in the context of, US culture in which advertising is kind of everywhere, this is really very, very stark. Now, if prohibitionists had had their way, these stores would have been plastered with posters illustrating the deleterious effects of alcohol on your body, and all of the bottles would have carried a warning label that this is a narcotic that's habit-forming.
And I see there's no place to sit down in that store either. No tasting, wine tasting, nothing like that. So it's great. That map is fantastic to see how this kind of the patchwork of controls and the legacy of control. And as you make a point, and other scholars have as well, end of prohibition actually led to greater surveillance in certain ways, in certain respects, of alcohol and spaces of consumption. So I think that's really interesting. The whole second half of the book really focuses on World War II, and in all, in kind of different ways, and it's really important. And so I was actually, I remember, and I've taught, you have this, one of the chapters is called Beer Goes to War, and it's an article that Lisa had published earlier, so I've taught it in my food history class. Students absolutely love it. It's the favorite reading every time I teach. But the students really get this point that the beer industry managed to present itself as like key to the war effort and a vital industry, which you might think is surprising given the tensions around Prohibition. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little more, and then why beer was able to do that. And I know to a certain extent why it was as opposed to whiskey, but wine and whiskey just could not do the same thing. And the comparison is really striking that beer occupies a special place during the war. So maybe you could, and talk about the war itself and its importance.
Yeah, I keep forgetting my little slide advancer. Okay. So World War II is really re-energizing for prohibitionists because they're thinking back, they think this is an opportunity to stage a major political comeback. They managed to get all sorts of emergency wartime prohibitions through in the previous war. They think they can do it again by sort of reviving some of the same arguments that we need a disciplined fighting force, we can't be wasting grain on, booze, and they really are quite aggressive in presenting their demands. This is a political coalition that's easily mobilized by tapping into Methodist and Baptist churches, and they flood Congress with petitions that ask for, and I think this is kind of a bold ask, a 10-mile moral zone around military training camps. Now, if you're in San Francisco or New Orleans, that's going to eat up a lot of the city too. So clearly the intention is not just to dry up the military's access, but also civilians too. And then the other demand that they revived from World War I is we want to, say we have to save food. So this, the modern brewery age and trade journal is really alarmed, and you can see from their headline, Deadly Parallel, they're remembering back to World War I. They're worried this is an industry that remains predominantly German-American, that had, the jingoism of World War I really made it possible to attack that industry very aggressively. They're worried that's going to come back again. And so they have a multi-pronged response. And one of their responses is to say, beer is a morale booster. And in fact, it's a patriotic thing to do. So ads, this is part of their Morale is a Lot of Little Things campaign, and it sort of connects drinking beer and puts it on the same moral plane as doing something like carving a pumpkin, or getting a goodbye kiss or a welcome home kiss, at the end of a hard work's day. The fact that they're using the language of rights is very significant. The language of rights was very muted during the campaign to repeal Prohibition, but it really comes to the fore during World War II. And of course, after a good day's work, they have to make some sort of gesture to sacrifice. So you can have your beer, and then notice here in this little inset, these two are examples of soldiers writing home saying, this is what I'm dreaming of. I'm homesick. I'm dreaming of my beer. We have to keep beer alive for our soldiers. And, then they have this other series, Beer Belongs, in this America of tolerance and good humor, neighborliness and pleasant living. Again, connecting the right to beer to the American heritage of personal freedom. So they're really playing into the wartime rhetoric that contrasts the United States with the fascist enemy. This is the country of tolerance. This is the country that values cultural pluralism. And you have to respect somebody's right to choose beer. And there's, a line, whether you want to drink beer or buttermilk, everyone has the right to their own choice. Now, what's implicit in all of these ads, which are kind of connecting beer to Americana, is a a kind of, making it American, making it middle class, making it wholesome. In this one, they're hiring these brilliant commercial artists. These are paintings you can get and put in your home if you wanted to. You see women drinking beer in this place, the community roof raising. But I think implicit here, not stated, is an important move, which is to distance beer from the raucous masculinity of the saloon and locate it in suburban, domestic, very wholesome settings, or more respectable, but very middle class settings like the Boston Pops concert. So now the most creative and innovative move that they make is to say that they're answering their prohibitionist critics who are saying beer wastes vital foodstuffs, and they're saying, no, we are ingenious recyclers who make every grain count. What happens when you brew beer is that you end up with these wonderful byproducts that can go back into livestock feed or that can go to the consumer in the form of brewer's yeast. Now, brewer's yeast is really significant because brewer's yeast is a great source of vitamin B. Vitamin B is the most celebrated vitamin of the war because it is, and vitamins are celebrated all over the place. It's kind of a pep pill. It's a mood enhancer. It is seen as, enabling defense workers to keep at it for long stretches. And so the idea is that you'll incorporate brewer's yeast into the food at the defense factory. Eventually, the military figures out how to debitter the brewer's yeast, and it makes its way into very tough biscuits for the soldiers. But that is this really clever argument that they make that really takes the wind out of the prohibitionist sails. They have no good answer for it. Shall I talk about?
I think, you've talked about, I think that's really important. So a lot of the book and the ads that you're showing here are dealing with the reinvention of alcohol on the home front, but the last chapter really focuses on the military and military rations. And when I was reading it, I was thinking about the tea industry really went after the military as well. My poor guys in England in their alleys only got tea. They probably were drinking other things, but your guys were getting alcohol. And so it's really interesting how these, but in both cases, the war becomes, even though these are ration goods, becomes really, the military itself becomes a very important venue for creating new tastes. So I know that you wanted to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, brewing kind of gets classified as an essential industry, in part because of the brewer's yeast connection, but more importantly because the beer industry is required to dedicate 15% of its production to the troops. The World War II is the first 20th century war in which enlisted men get to have alcohol again. And you can guess what they're given, which is, let's see if I can fast forward through a few slides. They get 3.2% beer. Yay. And, and this is a sharp contrast to, it's kind of a meager ration when you compare it to what combatants of other nations are getting, who have a rum ration, a whiskey ration, a wine ration. But the real trouble comes because the officer class gets access to a whole bunch of stuff. They have access to whiskey, wine, beer in the officers' mess. They have a 1 to 2 quart ration a month of, whiskey. And this creates incredible tension and discontent between enlisted men and the officer class. It creates, it really intensifies racial discord because, the only place to buy it is in the Army PX, and the Army PX is they're segregated Army PXs, and the ones that Black enlisted men and officers patronize are very poorly stocked. So there's intense conflict. The military, very deliberately regulates access to bars, hotels, restaurants in around the base and abroad, designating the best bars, restaurants for white enlisted men and officers, and the ones on the outskirts of the city for Black enlisted men and officers. And you really see the US military exporting Jim Crow abroad. You have white commanders in London who tell, the owners of hotels and bars, you cannot serve Black enlisted men or officers here, and if you do, we will declare the premises off limits for everybody. And the response from, so there's tension coming in two places, and anytime Black enlisted men or officers try to patronize one of these bars or hotels, they're met with violent resistance from within the military. So really intensifying racial discord. One of the responses of Black enlisted men and officers is to do sit-ins, do boycotts, try to enlist the Black press at home to publicize this. And you also have intensifying resentment of enlisted men and their officers. Now, I want you to look at this photograph on top, which is one of my favorite photographs of all time, because you have the enlisted man drinking the beer, but you see he's stuffed his pockets with another can. And in order to make 3.2 beer do its work, you saved up for a 3 cans per man beer party, and that is what he's doing. But you have in popular culture this image of the GI as kind of virtuous, wholesome, homesick, beer-loving, that comes out in the beer, advertising. It comes out in Ernie Pyle's reporting, which appears in 700 different newspapers, and he's sort of saying, oh, the GI is very alcohol deprived, and when he gets it, it's one of those small comforts, but is very sympathetic that, about the dreary existence of the infantryman's daily life, in which, as he writes, all the velvet has been removed from living. Now, I started here, and I thought, oh, they're not drinking very much, only when they get their, some sort of windfall. And then I realized, okay, well, this is censored reporting. And if you look at other sources, if you read memoirs, if you read oral histories, if you read the gripe columns in Yank magazine, their own Army newspaper, completely different image appears of the aggrieved, alcohol-deprived enlisted man. And that comes out in, cartoons like Sad Sack, which, always depicts the bumbling infantryman always searching for alcohol and women and always being thwarted in that search, either by bad luck or by malicious officers. In this case, you have malicious officers who have confiscated his alcohol. Bill Malden, did fantastic cartoons that appeared in Stars and Stripes. This one, for years after the war, was a favorite of veterans groups. And that was the experience that they had of seeing the German army had already looted everything. There was nothing much left. And so this one, they think they found a good stash, but realize that the Germans, them rats, them dirty, cold-blooded, swear-headed, stinking Huns, them atrocity-committing Huns have broken into the supply. This one, again, Willie and Joe, the scruffy infantrymen, on R&R trying to find a bar and realizing everything's off limits for the officer, or they have to wear a tie. To hell with it, let's go to the front. So those are some of the ways in which you see that really register. And I think with profound consequences, because by the end of the war, you really do have the sense sinking in that among enlisted men, black servicemen of all ranks, that alcohol is such a potent symbol of belonging and such an expected feature of the good life, that it really comes to be seen as an entitlement of citizenship and military service.
My poor tea drinking British soldiers. Actually, American soldiers complained when they were served tea. So. I think I'm going to switch gears here and think a little bit about, so I'm writing a book on public relations, and I learned so much from the way you approach public relations has a very important role in Lisa's book, not only advertising, we talk about the differences, but I wanted to ask some questions kind of related to that. So in the book, advertisers, market researchers, public relations experts are really key actors. And so you mine the archives of J. Walter Thompson, the advertising agency, the father of American PR, Edward Bernays, who's Floyd's nephew twice over. It's a complicated family history. And the market researcher, he was from Eastern Europe, Ernst Dichter. And we actually now have the digitized Dichter sources in our library. So after doing all that research, that it's now easily available. But you focus a lot on how these figures helped out the alcohol industry, and they worked with the wine, beer, and whiskey industry, changed it, you can see in the ads, changed images of drinking, but they make a lot of blunders, a lot, and that's what's so funny about the book, too. And yet the industry, of course, keeps relying on these experts to make their case. So I wondered if you wanted to talk about some of the ways in which these industries themselves gain legitimacy working for such the alcohol industry, which is spending an enormous amount of money on its all these persuasion industries, but also some of the blunders and maybe successes.
Yeah.
Because they misread a lot as well.
Right. I mean, it takes, each of these industries is internally divided, and it takes a lot of convincing to get people to pay into a collective fund that will pay for the expertise of the public relations expert, that will pay for a massive advertising campaign. They eventually get there through a long, complicated process. But yeah, there are some interesting blunders. I'm going to go back to my images here. I'm trying to remember where it is. Yeah, okay. All right, so this one is from 1883. This is not a post-repeal blunder, but anti-prohibitionists sort of think, we can just remember this is a very German-American industry with a tradition of viewing, as many Central European nations do, of viewing beer as liquid food. And that's what this is. This is very well-intentioned. This is very earnest. The little toddler, ruddy with good cheer, serenely sips his lager beer. That's a pretty gigantic mug there. Very rosy cheeks, pleasingly plump, kind of dressed in an American flag. You see the stripes. Okay, so that bombed. What does Edward Bernays decide to do? I mean, he's got to appeal to his client, and they haven't gotten over their fascination with the liquid food argument. So they do revive it, and they plaster, on billboards, on the sides of buses, beer is nature's food. They come out with these recipe books in which the melons with beer dressing appears. And that pretty much fails. I mean, it gets mocked in newspapers, and eventually they just change tacks and go a different direction. But they have to be kind of persuaded out of it, and they have to see the failure of it. In the wine industry, wine has an interesting dilemma because it's viewed as both too highbrow and too lowbrow, so how do you get the middle? And if you overemphasize respectability, you run the risk of inviting ridicule. And this is an early offering of J. Walter Thompson, part of the collectively funded advertising campaign. These are Depression-era ads. And one of the things they do is collect a roster of celebrity endorsers. So for wine, they have Norman Rockwell, John Steinbeck, the actress Lynn Fontaine. In this case, it's Mrs. Basil Rathbone, who's the wife, who had her own acting history, but she's the wife of the more famous actor Basil Rathbone. And here they come out with their, ad saying, more and more people like to enjoy leisurely, genial evenings with wine. This is playing a contrast to those, rowdier cocktail parties in Prohibition era. They're making it very middle class. They're making it respectable. They're trying to inculcate this idea of drinking in moderation. But again, I mean, they're really leaning into the luxurious living end of it. And it kind of doesn't go very far. I do like this one. The very quirky choice of Ty Cobb, who some of you may know as a very famous baseball player known for his profanity, his aggressive, underhanded playing, his hot temper. And here they've refigured him as an emblem of genteel respectability. I don't know if the aim here was to kind of strike a kind of democratic appeal with this well-known guy who's got this reputation for being hot-tempered, with, appeal to elegance. Certainly the fact that he's very masculine is doing some other important cultural work, which is to make sherry, which is very, feminine kind of beverage, seem more masculine. This one didn't fail entirely. There's some evidence that sports writers picked this up and started writing columns that said, oh, and this athlete drinks wine, and this athlete drinks wine. And the wine industry must have been pleased with that because you weren't supposed to make health claims, but there's an implicit health claim being made by the sports writer that this will make you, a successful athlete. So those are a couple of examples.
I think we'll want to open it up soon, but I just want to ask one question that's kind of following from also what you've been talking about. Well, so the book appears in the California Studies Food and Culture, and as I was looking at the book, I realized, which I've read many of the books and used them in that series, it's a phenomenal series. It's interdisciplinary, international, has more than 80 titles now. I think your title number 83, which is really remarkable for a book series. And it has some of the most famous kind of books in food studies, including like Marion Nestle's Food Politics, How the Food Industry Influences Nutrition and Health. And then one of my favorites is Sarah Beskey's The Darjeeling distinction, labor injustice, fair trade, tea plantations in India. All things come back to tea. But it's just an extraordinary. You could read those books and really understand the field of food studies. So I wonder why you chose to publish in the series. In part, there's a separate discipline of alcohol and drug studies. So to combine, the whole point you can see about combining with food history is important. It'll shape the way your book's read, I think. And I wondered then also if you could talk about how, in a way, you see yourself as a food historian and like reading and teaching food history. Did it change the way you approached alcohol in general and the kind of methods that maybe you use? I'm sure may not work as well for whiskey, but for beer and wine goes with food,
Yeah. I actually was very influenced by the food history literature from the get-go. I mean, one of the most fascinating kind of literature for me, and I think it's very influential for your work too, is the literature on war and food, because it opens all sorts of questions about, when there are massive global food shortages, the combatant nations are wrestling with food shortages and how to manage access to them, and imposing all sorts of interesting food controls. And, what especially do you do when those food controls impose restrictions on beloved foods like eggs and meat, or beloved foods like sugar, whiskey, and coffee that deliver psychoactive pleasures? And so one of the questions in that literature that I found really fascinating was, in what way do wars help to reinvent and redefine the meanings of food? They're changing food practices. And there's a tension there because there's this opportunity and invitation for culinary innovation. And I'll give you an example of that in just a second. But there's also a yearning to return to the familiar. And that's a tension that plays out in very interesting ways. Let me advance to, I think I have to go back. Okay, California wine industry. Okay, it gets off the celebrity endorsers and realizes that, we have a way of aligning our product with the Food Fights for Freedom campaign, which is all about, obeying rationing orders and saving your food, conserving your food, redirecting your purchases to more abundant proteins, which would have included lots of organ meats. Variety meats was what they called them. And so the California wine industry steps in and says, you don't like your leftovers, you don't like eating tough meat, which is the only thing you can get, just soak it in some wine. And you have tenderized meat, you have a way of making these seemingly less appealing proteins like oxtails absolutely delectable. This will be food fit for kings. And they're really getting away from, what's interesting about these ads is that the industry's kind of getting away from the iconic meal of the protein plus two sides. These are one-pot meals. These are vegetarian meals, like the kidney beans. So that's one way in which they do that. And I think the other theme of food that's important is that the path back to legitimacy for the alcoholic beverage industry rides on food. It used to be that beer and wine were considered, in the 17th century before, they were considered commonly food. But when spirits come in or mass produced in the 18th century, that's when wine and beer and spirits all get exiled from the category of food. So one of the stories I think I'm telling is about how they're trying in a variety of ways to bring wine and beer back into the category of food, to bridge that divide, to tighten it up. Yeah.
I think it might be time to open it up to audience questions. So should we pass these around?
We'll bring the microphone to you so you can ask your questions. And then raise your hand. Microphone.
Thank you for the presentation. Wonderful. How did the wine industry, the growers themselves, recover, considering that wine takes time to mature, then storage and distribution, and we heard about the ghost wineries of Northern California, and many of them did not survive. So how did they get about to replant and reproduce the wine?
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic question, because until there's a big enough demand for wine, there's no incentive to replant. And one of the things that Prohibition did, it was actually terrible for the wine industry, but it was a boon for the grape industry, because grapes could be shipped to, immigrant enclaves on the East Coast or in the Midwest where they would make homemade wine. There's a very curious exemption in the Volstead Act which lays out the law for enforcing the 18th Amendment, which says that you can make up to 200 gallons of non-intoxicating fruit juice. They never define what non-intoxicating is in that particular segment. In the rest of the Volstead Act, it's 0.5% alcohol. And you have some juries that are very sympathetic and will simply not convict. You have another very ugly reaction in which, the KKK is very prominent, and they will use violence against the home winemakers. So what happens, this is winding away to get to your question, what happens is that growers in California start replanting to grapes that will ship well across long distances. And one of the favorite grapes is called the Alicante Bouschet, which produces this deep red color, which means you can keep repressing it and remaking it. So it can go through a second and third pressing and you can still have wine. So, if you got 150 gallons out of that one lot, this gives you like 600. Alicante Bouschet is not a very good wine grape, but that's what's there. And they're raisin grapes that are, the wine industry essentially is a table grape industry, a wine industry, and a raisin industry. And during the 1930s, when there's a lot of overproduction, if you can't sell the table grapes, they might get turned into raisins. If you can't sell the raisin grapes, they're all ending up in the crushers in the wine. And so you end up with a pretty mediocre wine. And it takes wine is the toughest sell of beer, whiskey, and wine. Wine is the hardest to sell, and you do not get a big enough demand to produce the economic incentive to replant to really good quality wine grapes.
Thank you, Lisa and Erika. I can't wait to read the book. I have a small comment and then a question. So the small comment that as you know, I'm a Soviet historian, and that store, the wine store, looked exactly like a Soviet grocery store, and the long line just proved that it doesn't matter how unattractive the store is if you have a product that people actually want to buy. So, but my question, thinking about, well, I actually went to college in a place with 3.2 beer. So that was interesting to hear about the history of that. But what I wondered is, was there any effort to sell non-alcoholic beer and wine? As you probably know now, they're really popular. Non-alcoholic beer is pretty good. Non-alcoholic wine is not very good. But I wondered whether those existed back then, whether the producers thought of trying to create the same effect with mocktails and so forth, the way people are doing now.
Yeah, they really did have non-alcoholic beer during Prohibition, and it bombed. It was terrible. I mean, they gave it names like Pivo and Bevo and Nero, like near the right thing, but they were, names that in Europe would have meant beer. It tasted terrible, and what people would do instead of drink, it was called near beer. Instead, they went to something called needle beer, in which you take the non-alcoholic beer and you inject it with whiskey. So, now the other way that people got beer was, the brewers are very clever. They marketed separately, intended for use only in baking, malt syrup, separately, yeast, with the Budweiser yeast, Budweiser malt syrup. People combined them and got their own beer.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I want to know a little bit more. Can you tell us a little bit more about the research? Like, where did you find this, what was the process for your research for this book?
Yeah, there's no end to where you can look. And so one place that might sound very strange to anybody except Erika is that trade journals are fascinating. And trade journals are fascinating because they're a lot more candid than, they're not embarrassed, so they reveal a lot. And they're interesting interpreters of cultural and social trends. So you learn to read them as kind of a cultural historian. It's very, very interesting stuff. I used oral histories. There's a large collection related to the California wine industry. I looked at some whiskey distillers' oral histories. I went to the National Archives and looked at the War Production Board and the Office of Price Administration and the War Food Administration. I went to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library, and one of the best things there were the diaries of Henry Morgenthau, who was the Treasury Secretary. And the Treasury Department's in charge of, regulating alcohol. The diaries are kind of a confusing name. What they were full transcripts of the Treasury Department meetings. So that was just fascinating. It's all laid out there. And here's one more place where the New Deal comes in. There were a lot of whiskey shortages, and because of that, a lot of violations of black markets. It really got out of control. The Treasury Department didn't want to have anything to do with it. The OPA didn't want to have anything to do with it. But eventually, the behavior of violating whiskey price controls threatens to spill over onto all the other fronts. So they say, okay, we've got to figure out a way to get this back under control. And Morgenthau is a fascinating figure because he saw one of his greatest achievements as breaking the black market that still existed in the mid-30s And he thinks if he can't get this under control again, that will be a huge blow to the reputation of the New Deal, because then repeal would not have worked.
Well, my question stems from like my own experience with wine or just wine tasting. Oftentimes I don't know, I find myself being like the only person of color at a winery, or even like the people serving wine will say, yay, like like thank you for coming, like we want to see more diversity, I guess. And so my question is there a history of wine industries reaching out to people of color? Like even the ads show like, mainly European Americans. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the dilemma that the industry faces, in that, where wine is beloved is in communities with Southern and Eastern European immigrants. They all along are making their own wine. Italian Americans really dominate the California wine industry. But these ads, where you see a lot of white middle-class people, it's in part a kind of deliberate choice to make wine middle-class, white, and respectable, because you have that tension between it being too lowbrow and too highbrow. There's also some anger within the Italian American winemakers, are actually angry at their own Italian American cohorts because they continue to make homemade wine after repeal, and they're not buying the commercial stuff. But you do have, some, in food, in cookbooks, I consulted a lot of cookbooks, Italian spaghetti recipes, cooking with wine, and Italian food is kind of promoted. But I think that kind of reaching out that you're talking about comes later.
So as you were saturating yourself with all of this research, how did that impact your beverages of choice? Did you go by grape or?
That's a great question. I mean, this is research that kind of makes you hungry. And when you're looking at the ads and like, oh, the sherry and the almonds, I thought, oh, that would be good. But I did actually have to, in order to understand, what they were talking about, it's important to do this kind of research. So, I mean, I knew about wine, come from a wine drinking family, but whiskey, not so much. And, what was the difference between a blended whiskey and a straight whiskey? This really mattered in the industry. This really mattered in marketing. They talked, never talked about it in ads in any specific way. Taste was described as smooth. That was what taste was. So I wanted to know, okay, well, what does it taste like? So I did do a whiskey tasting with some people who knew something about whiskey. I was very curious about this very strange beer cookery recipe book. And I was very suspicious of the chocolate beer cake. But I made it. And there are about 3 people in this room, besides myself, who can tell you that it was the best chocolate cake ever. It's just, you use Guinness, you don't use, Miller Lite. Use this rich, sweeter beer, and you don't taste the beer, it just does what coffee does to chocolate, it intensifies the chocolate. So, yeah, I think more in cooking than in tasting. And the chocolate bourbon pecan bars were, came out of my research.
And I'm, again, like others, can't wait to read and drink the book. One of the important points I think you make is that this is not, just like no holds barred, this is not a great moment of liberation, this is a project of re-regulation, So one of the things I was thinking about when you're talking about near beer was the age limits. Because I've always thought about near beer as one of, at least in some places, I think, like 18 to 21, you're allowed to drink beer. Anyway, but I'm just wondering about the whole, this is partly triggered also by that ad from the 1880s. So what happens with youth and alcohol? Like, how does that play into all of this? And I'm thinking about juvenile delinquents and youth gangs and alcohol and all that.
Yeah. I mean, each state has different regulations on the legal limit, and some might loosen it for the 3.2% beer. I think some lowered it if you were purchasing that. In my research in this time period, the concern about it's really a concern about our taverns being regulated. Taverns are serving minors, and that adds to the industry's kind of image problem, and eventually the beer industry joins forces with the regulators and says, well, we're gonna make sure that they monitor this. I don't think it was a promise they fully delivered on, but that's.
When did drinking ages become 18, 21? Because they were all over the map for a while.
They are all over the map.
They still are all over the map.
Well, no, I think it's 20. In the 80s, they raised it across the board to 21. I don't know if any have gone back down. So I'm seeing shaking heads. It's still 21 across the board. That's true in New Jersey?
Yeah.
Okay.
New Jersey has always had actually a higher age limit than we just all wrote to New York. I'm just curious, when did it become 18 versus 21? Why is that
Okay.
magic number?
Why?
What's the science behind that? Or is there any,
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you the context for raising it in the 80s to 21 was sort of what the industry referred to as a neo-prohibitionist movement. But this is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. This is when you get labels for fetal alcohol syndrome on the bottles. And that's when the age is raised kind of across the board to 21. But I think it's all over the place in this time period.
Hi, Professor Jacobson. I'm in the back. Hi. So I'm thinking, I look forward to reading your book. Thank you for the presentation, and Professor Rappaport as well. But I'm thinking more so of the Hispanic American experience. Right after the Mexican Revolution, there's a lot of migration, and I'm sure some of these men ended up being drafted. I'm curious if in your research you saw in these military newspapers, and you mentioned that a lot of soldiers had gripes. I'm curious if you saw any soldiers craving, hey, I want some tequila or mezcal. And I'm curious, did you see any of that in your research? Thank you.
That's a great question. No, I didn't. I mean, tequila does come in. That's in the World War II, precisely because there are whiskey shortages. That's when more broader sampling of tequila begins to take place, but it doesn't really take off as a whole. I mean, I did look in memoirs about Mexican American enlisted men, and the only story I have from that one is that, you know, I think he was in Italy and started drinking and got a terrible, terrible stomachache and drinking this Italian wine. And his mate tested it for him and said, "Oh, that's not wine, that's vinegar you've been drinking." And that's a problem. I mean, there was like an unfamiliarity with these. This is a learning experience.
Thank you for the talk. And also, my question was, women made up a very significant demographic of the Prohibition movement, and now we're very directly targeted by advertisers and manufacturers for their role as the guardians of the home and suburbia. So in your research, did the Prohibition movement's dialogue change or adapt as a result of these industry advertising tactics towards women, both in their ranks and to the general public?
You know, the prohibitionists are not very nimble. I mean, they really stick to the same playbook as in World War I, and they're still really leaning into moral purity. But one of the journals that I read a lot was Christian Century, which had a little bit more of a liberal leaning, but was very, you know, dry in its orientation. Supported prohibition, and they were so good at nailing exactly what the brewers were doing, what the vintners were doing. They understood the game plan, and they probably diagnosed it better than anybody else. So they're cynical, they get it, and they're absolutely outraged because brewers and vintners are selling the gospel of moderation. And they say, they've stolen our moral thunder. You know, they're trying to make our indulgences look like, you know, clean living. And they're mad because they're succeeding at it. But yes, I think they don't rest. Every year, their effort to establish these, you know, moral zones around the training camps is revived. Every year, it's defeated. And when I went to the Library of Congress, I found, you know, box after box after box of these petitions. So they don't stop trying.